June 25th, 2026, The Hague, Netherlands. The NATO Summit is wrapping up. Cameras are pointed at Washington. Microphones are chasing Berlin and Warsaw. The big players are doing what big players always do, making noise, taking credit, demanding applause. And then a small country steps to the podium. A country with no nuclear weapons, no aircraft carrier, no permanent seat on the UN Security Council. A country most people associate more with pastel de nata and Cristiano Ronaldo than with military strategy. Portuguese Prime Minister Luís Montenegro leans into the microphone and says calmly, almost quietly, that Portugal commits to 5% of its GDP on defense by 2035. 5%, not 2, not 3, 5. The highest target announced by any NATO nation. Higher than the United States at 3.4%. Higher than Poland, which was already shocking everyone at 4.1%. Higher than Germany, France, the UK, every country you actually think of when someone says European military power. The room didn't erupt. There were no headlines screaming about it. The news cycle moved on within hours, and that right there, that silence is the whole story. Because Portugal has been the most strategically underestimated nation in the Western Alliance for decades. Not because it lacks ambition, not because it lacks capability, but because it has mastered something almost no other country has figured out: how to be absolutely essential without ever being obvious about it. This video is about that mastery. It's about a country that built an empire before empires were fashionable. A country sitting on one of the most valuable pieces of real estate on the planet. A country that just made a defense commitment that should have broken the internet and didn't. So let's fix that. Let's talk about Portugal. To understand why Portugal matters militarily today, you have to go back. Not to learn history for history's sake, but to understand a pattern. Because this country doesn't do things by accident. 500 years ago, Portugal didn't conquer the world by being the biggest. It didn't have the largest army. It didn't have endless resources. What it had was geography, innovation, and an almost obsessive understanding of how to project power across distance. The Caravel, the iconic Portuguese sailing vessel of the Age of Discovery, wasn't just a ship. It was a military doctrine on a hull. Light, fast, maneuverable, built specifically to go further than anyone thought possible and come back with intelligence and resources that changed the balance of power. Before England and Spain had finished arguing about who invented what, Portugal had mapped Brazil, India, Mozambique, Macau, and Angola, and opened trade routes that financed European civilization for the next 2 centuries. The Portuguese didn't just explore. They built fortresses. They established maritime patrol routes. They created logistics networks across 4 continents. They maintained supply chains across 10,000 miles of open ocean, centuries before satellites, before radio, before the internet. That isn't just impressive, it's a template, because the mindset that sent João II's navigators into the unknown. This idea that strategic presence beats brute force, that intelligence beats size, that positioning beats mass, that mindset never left. It just quietly became the DNA of modern Portuguese military doctrine, and you're about to see exactly how. Open any map of the Atlantic Ocean, not of Europe, of the Atlantic itself. Find the midpoint between North America and continental Europe. Now look slightly south of that midpoint, out in open water, 1,000 kilometers from the Portuguese coast. There they are, the Azores. 9 volcanic islands, scattered across the mid-Atlantic, like nature's most strategic coincidence, and they belong to Portugal. Now, here's why this matters so much that NATO literally cannot function without it. Imagine you're the US military and you need to move an entire battle group from the East Coast to the Eastern Mediterranean. Fighters, bombers, cargo planes, surveillance aircraft, all of them crossing the Atlantic in a matter of hours. Every single one of them needs the same thing: a place to refuel, a place to land in an emergency, a place to coordinate communications mid-journey. Without the Azores, you're flying fuel blind across an ocean. With them, you have an unsinkable aircraft carrier sitting exactly where you need it. Lajes Field, the joint US-Portuguese airbase on Terceira Island, has been NATO's mid-Atlantic backbone since World War II. It supports 15,000 aircraft a year, including fighters and cargo planes from the US and more than 20 allied nations. It provides rapid deployment support, aerial refueling coordination, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance operations. It is not an option. It is a requirement. During the Cold War, Lajes was the cork in the bottle of the GIUK gap. the choke point between Greenland, Iceland, and the UK that Soviet submarines would have had to cross to threaten the Atlantic. Portugal's geography made that corking possible. Today, with Russian submarine activity in the North Atlantic at levels not seen since the 1980s, that corking matters again. But the Azores are only part of the story. Portugal controls the third largest exclusive economic zone in Europe. That's an enormous stretch of Atlantic Ocean, where Portuguese naval and air assets conduct maritime patrol, monitor submarine activity, track shipping lanes, and guard something that most people have never thought about but couldn't live without for a single day: undersea cables. There are thousands of kilometers of subsea data cables and energy pipelines running through Portuguese maritime territory. These cables carry the internet. They carry banking transactions. They carry military communications. They are, without any exaggeration, the arteries of the modern digital world. A single deliberate strike on the right cable could black out financial systems across multiple continents. Portugal watches over them with submarines, with maritime patrol aircraft, with sonar systems and underwater sensors, and an Atlantic surveillance network that very few people talk about, and even fewer adversaries would want to test. And here's the angle that almost nobody discusses. Portugal is now investing in space-based surveillance of its maritime zone, satellite monitoring of shipping routes, submarine signatures, environmental anomalies, near real-time data feeding into a system that turns the Atlantic from a blind spot into a chessboard where Portugal can see every move. When you add it all up, Portugal doesn't just sit at the edge of Europe. It sits at the hinge point of the entire Western security architecture, and it knows it. Now, let's talk about what's actually been happening on the ground, because this is where the story goes from interesting to genuinely remarkable. For years, Portugal was the NATO member that analysts would politely describe as underinvesting, defense spending hovering around 1.5% of GDP, equipment aging, procurement programs moving at a bureaucratic pace that made continental drift look fast. Then something shifted. In June 2025, Lisbon publicly moved forward its pledge to reach NATO's 2% GDP target, 4 full years ahead of the previous timeline. Not just rhetoric, binding legislation, money already allocated, programs already running. The Military Programming Law 2023 to 2034 commits 5.57 billion euros to modernizing the Portuguese military across every domain: Army, Navy, Air Force, cyber, space, intelligence, all of it. And that number is scheduled to be revised upward in 2027. The Army's 2025 budget was boosted by 221 million euros, 5 times the initial allocation for that year. The flagship investments include modernizing the Pandur-wheeled armored vehicles with 100 million euros, a new short-range air defense system for 45 million euros, tactical communications upgrades, micro-UAV systems, and an anti-tank program reboot. But the Air Force is where things get particularly interesting. In December 2025, Portugal became the first Air Force in the world to receive the NATO-configured A-29N Super Tucano, 5 aircraft delivered, with a full dozen operational by 2026. The Chief of Staff of the Portuguese Air Force called it a decisive step in modernization and noted, with quiet Portuguese satisfaction, that Portugal had positioned itself as a reference among allied forces. First in the world, not last, first. And on the fighter replacement front, this is where 2026 has delivered a twist that nobody saw coming. Portugal had been on track to acquire the F-35, America's 5th generation stealth fighter, the prestige purchase of the modern Western Air Force. Then came Trump's political pressure on allied nations, his combative posture toward Canada, and suddenly Lisbon started publicly reconsidering. Reports emerged in early 2026 suggesting Portugal was looking at the Saab Gripen, a Canadian-built variant, as an alternative. Whether driven by pure strategic logic, a message to Washington, or both, the signal was clear. Portugal is not a passive consumer of whatever America offers. It is an active strategic actor that makes its own calculations, and those calculations are serious. The KC-39 Millennium, a Brazilian-designed military transport and aerial refueling aircraft now operated by Portugal, is one of the most capable medium-lift platforms in any NATO air force, and it slots perfectly into Portugal's role as a logistical hub for transatlantic operations. When you need to move troops or supplies fast, across distance, without depending on American bases, Portugal has the asset. The Navy is modernizing its frigates, its patrol vessels, and most critically, its Tridente-class submarines. These are AIP, Air Independent Propulsion, submarines. That means they can operate submerged for weeks without needing to surface to run diesel engines. They are nearly silent. They are ideal for the North Atlantic environment. And they don't just patrol. They coordinate with unmanned underwater systems, extending Portugal's reach and surveillance capability far beyond what a manned vessel alone could achieve. Then, in March 2026, came the Hague announcement, the 5% GDP commitment by 2035, 3.5% in direct military spending, equipment, training, personnel, and an additional 1.5% in dual-use civilian military infrastructure, cybersecurity, resilience, communications, logistics. 12.5 billion euros per year at projected GDP levels from a country that was spending less than 3 billion euros 3 years ago. This isn't a military spending increase. It's a strategic transformation, and it's backed by something most European nations can't claim: a fiscal surplus. Portugal is not borrowing its way to rearmament. It's investing from a position of financial strength. Here's something that tends to get lost in the discussion about military power. In the 21st century, the most decisive battles may never be fought on land at all. They'll be fought in the electromagnetic spectrum, under the sea, in cyberspace, and across thousands of kilometers of open ocean where surveillance, detection, and early warning determine outcomes long before a single shot is fired. Portugal already operates in all of those domains, and it has been quietly mastering them for years. The REPMIS exercise, robotic experimentation and prototyping with maritime unmanned systems, is held annually off the Portuguese coast and has become NATO's premier laboratory for autonomous maritime warfare. Portugal isn't just hosting this exercise, it's shaping the doctrinal future of how the alliance fights at sea. We're talking about swarms of unmanned surface vehicles, autonomous underwater drones, aerial surveillance systems coordinating in real time with submarine assets. All of it tested, refined, and operationally validated in Portuguese waters, under Portuguese coordination. While other nations are still writing policy papers about autonomous warfare, Portugal is running the field experiments. And the cyber dimension is growing just as fast. Portugal has been upgrading its defense networks, developing cyber warfare capabilities, and building real-time threat monitoring systems that integrate with NATO's broader intelligence architecture. It's a key node in European intelligence sharing, not a peripheral one. This matters more than most people realize, because in a conflict that begins with cyber attacks on infrastructure, disinformation campaigns, and electronic warfare before a single conventional weapon moves, the nations that have invested in detection, resilience, and response capability are the ones that shape the opening moves. Portugal has made those investments. Hard power without reach is just expensive metal. Portugal understood this 500 years ago, and it understands it now. The Community of Portuguese Language Countries, the CPLP, links Portugal to Brazil, Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, São Tomé and Príncipe, East Timor, and Equatorial Guinea. That's roughly 300 million people across 4 continents, connected by language, history, and in many cases, active military cooperation agreements. This isn't nostalgia, it's strategy. When NATO needs a stabilizing presence in West Africa, an increasingly critical theater as Russian and Chinese influence expands, Portugal doesn't need a translator, a cultural briefing, or 6 months of diplomatic groundwork. It already has the relationships, the language, and in many cases, troops already trained alongside local forces. Portugal has run training missions in Angola, Mozambique, and Cape Verde. It has participated in peacekeeping operations in East Timor, Bosnia, Kosovo, Lebanon, and Mali. Its track record is impeccable. Show up, do the work, leave things better than you found them. Don't make it about you. And the training dimension deserves its own spotlight. Portugal's military academies and special operations schools are becoming international hubs. They're not just training Portuguese officers, they're training the future generals and defense ministers of allied and partner nations, from Africa to South America to Eastern Europe. When you train someone's military leaders, you don't just create competency, you create networks, you create trust, you create allies who, decades later, remember where they learned to lead and who taught them. That is the slowest, quietest, and most durable form of power there is. Portugal has been building it for years, and the Special Operations Forces themselves, the commandos, the paratroopers, the Destacamento de Ações Especiais, are elite in every credible measure. Amphibious assault trained, unconventional warfare capable, hostage rescue qualified, deployable globally on short notice, in environments ranging from mountain terrain to dense jungle to open ocean insertion. They don't make headlines. That's intentional. The most effective special operations forces never do. Now let's step back and ask the question that actually matters. Why does a country this size, with a population of about 10 million, without nuclear weapons, without a massive conscript army, why does it matter so much? The answer isn't found in any single weapon system or defense budget line. It's found in a doctrine, a way of thinking about what military power actually is. Portugal doesn't try to match America, Russia, or China in brute force. It would lose that competition immediately, and it knows it. Instead, Portugal has built its military value around three things: access, reliability, and multiplier effect. Access, because of the Azores, because of Lajes, because of the Atlantic EEZ, because of the CPLP network. Portugal gives NATO reach it would not otherwise have reliability, because Portugal shows up every exercise, every deployment, every commitment, without drama, without conditions, without renegotiating when things get politically uncomfortable. In an era when alliance cohesion is under stress from inside and outside, reliable partners are not just useful, they are invaluable. And multiplier effect, because Portugal's capabilities enhance every other ally it operates alongside. Its logistical hubs make American power projection faster. Its submarine surveillance makes NATO's anti-submarine warfare network stronger. Its training programs make partner militaries more capable. Its soft power connections make Western influence in Africa and Latin America more durable. Portugal doesn't win battles alone. It makes sure the alliance wins wars. That is a form of strategic intelligence that very few nations have mastered. And in a world where alliances are being stress tested daily, where the question of who you can actually count on is getting harder to answer, Portugal's answer is consistent, every time. Let's put all of this in context, because the pace of change in 2025 and 2026 is unlike anything Portugal has done in modern history. The €800 billion Rearm Europe plan announced by the European Commission in March 2025 is accelerating Portugal's acquisition timeline. Programs that were planned for the early 2030s are being moved forward. Capabilities that were aspirational are becoming contractual. The Army is acquiring 36 Caesar Mark II self-propelled 155mm howitzers. These are the same systems that have proven devastatingly effective in Ukraine: precision, range, mobility. Portugal is not acquiring them for decoration. Micro UAV systems, 40 units purchased directly from Army revenues in 2025, are being integrated into ground force doctrine. Eyes in the sky that cost a fraction of a manned aircraft, but multiply battlefield awareness exponentially. Short-range air defense, upgraded anti-tank systems, modernized tactical communications. Every one of these investments addresses a real gap, a real lesson learned from watching how modern warfare actually unfolds, not how defense procurement manuals written in the 1990s said it would. And the 2% GDP target, reached ahead of schedule in 2025, is now merely the floor. The ceiling is 5% by 2035. To understand how dramatic that is, if Portugal sustains this trajectory, its annual defense budget by 2035 will be larger than several current NATO members' total defense spending today, from the same country, from the same economy. The difference is commitment and clarity of purpose. Portugal decided what it is. It decided to matter, and it's backing that decision with money, contracts, and strategy in ways that would have been unimaginable a decade ago. So let's return to the question in the title. Is Portugal one of Europe's most important military powers? Not in the Hollywood sense. It won't be fighting a peer adversary alone. It won't be launching unilateral operations. It won't be the nation whose name appears in the first paragraph of the war's history. But here is what it will be. It will be the country whose airfields NATO uses to surge forces across the Atlantic when time is everything. It will be the country whose submarines are silently tracking threats through the deep Atlantic while the surface world sleeps. It will be the country whose undersea cable surveillance prevented a digital catastrophe that never made the news because Portugal caught it first. It will be the country whose training programs shaped the general who stabilized a West African state before it became the next ungoverned space. It will be the country that committed to 5% of GDP on defense, more than than anyone and quietly built the architecture to match. Portugal is not loud. It was never going to be loud. Loudness is for countries that need to compensate. Portugal doesn't compensate, it positions. There's a Portuguese concept, saudade, this deep, bittersweet longing that runs through the culture. Writers have spent centuries trying to fully translate it, but maybe its military expression is simpler. It's a country that knows what it once was, understands precisely what it is now, and has decided, deliberately, methodically, and without fanfare, what it intends to become. In a world full of noise, of military theater, of defense spending announcements treated as performance art, Portugal stands apart. It doesn't perform power, it exercises it, and in the end, that distinction between performing and exercising may be the clearest definition of strategic maturity there is. Portugal is the Atlantic's quiet guardian, Europe's most underestimated military architect, and the country that just told NATO it's ready to carry more weight than anyone else. The question is no longer whether Portugal matters. The question is, how long before everyone else finally notices?